who are we? CCLA difference, what? Difference makers.
Welcome, everybody. Ooh, we've got a huge crowd today. Huge crowd. Okay, no, really, though, thanks for joining us after lunch. And for joining us for mathematics after lunch. I know math class after lunchtime is always really, really tough. So I'm anticipating some of that same energy right now. But Heidi and I are here to present flexible means in mathematics. Yes, okay. So I'm Arienne. I am a coordinator of mathematics here at Santa Clara County Office of Education and also part of the CCLA grant. And Heidi.
Hello, I'm Heidi Espindola. I'm from Placer County Office of Ed. I'm the STEM coordinator and part of the CCLA grant. And Arienne, I'm going to be right back.
Okay, no problem. And so one of the reasons Heidi's not here is because, yes, but we have become a peanut zone. So that's it. Okay. So we're going to go ahead on our goals for today. And I'm going to have to move her around, I think, a little bit. Our goals for today are to consider like why math is a different ballgame. Like every time we go around and we talk about universal design for learning or learning acceleration, we hear a lot of, feedback from teachers about like, but math's different, right? Math's different. How can we do that with math? No, we need to make sure that we follow a specific progression and go through math. And also consider it in terms of historical instructional practices and mindsets about the content area. You'll see that we'll be reading off of the slides, but that's mainly for accessibility, okay, just in case. We're going to revisit and practice separating the goals from the means and general characteristics of a quality UDL-ified goal. Okay? And then we're going to have an opportunity to redesign the instances when the means is the goal. That's the case with math, and explore how to still identify and focus on the underlying conceptual understanding that's required to enact a specific skill. So if you go to the tiny URL, you should be able to access our resources for today. I'm going to drop that. I think Kristen went ahead and dropped that in the chat as well for our virtual folks. All right. Okay. Need some time to access that. You should be able to get to our slide deck from there. Okay, so this afternoon we're going to do our welcome. We're going to go ahead and set the context and make some connections. We're going to talk about universal design for learning and why math is a different ballgame. We're going to also talk about UDL-ified goals and what to do when the means is the goal. We'll end with an intentional close and then have some time for reflection and feedback. So this is Heidi's activity, but I'm going to go ahead and start us off with this. I want you to think about which quadrant you're in. Okay, and the quadrants represent, or the x-axis, okay, represents learning acceleration, and the y-axis represents our understanding of UDL. So if we are in quadrant A, that means we're thinking what's learning acceleration, and we also have the understanding that UDL helps me remove barriers for all of my students is quadrant B. Quadrant C, you're like, UDL. Or D, I've been implementing learning acceleration for years. So in the chat, if you could go ahead, in the chat, go ahead and kind of talk about what quadrant are you in? And over here, with all of us here. Where do you think you're at?
It's so bad.
And I can bring the microphone around. I don't know if that would help, but since you're not us.
I would say like kind of right on the x-axis between B and D.
Oh, right.
Right on the x-axis between B and D.
Yeah, I agree. Somewhere around B. That's what I believe.
And then Kristen, anyone mention anything in the chat about where they're at?
Ashley mentioned she is in quadrant A.
Okay.
Learning acceleration.
Nice. Okay. And then, and Ashley, we will probably be able, it's not really part of the slide deck, but I think as we go through, we can talk a little bit more about how learning acceleration relates to our topic for today. Okay, so moving right along. Okay, since we had a very, very small group, I hope we're okay with not doing the breakouts for this piece. We can do more, I think, later on. And talked about what quadrant we are in. Oops. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what learning acceleration is. And Ashley, thank you for pointing that out. So learning acceleration is moving forward with grade level content with support. Okay. It's prioritizing content and making sure that we're giving access to grade level content despite knowledge and skill gaps. So no matter where our students might be academically, that we are always prioritizing that grade level content. And also identifying the most crucial knowledge and skills that students need and integrating those into lessons. So instead of taking an entire day to revisit a prerequisite math standard, we're incorporating those in tinier chunks within the lessons, so that the students have the scaffold for them to be able to access the grade level content. Okay, so universal design for learning is actually one of the 5 components of learning acceleration according to our CCLA. Okay, it's important that we're able to reach as many learners as possible. And one key thing about learning acceleration is that we meet our students where they're at, that we acknowledge their prior knowledge, or we acknowledge what their knowledge they're coming in with, and able to meet them where they're at, as opposed to thinking about what skills they do not have, right? We're thinking about our diverse learners, whether it be based on ethnicity, race, socioeconomic, students with disabilities, all of those subgroups, and even those that are dually, triply identified, and try to design lessons and tasks and assessments that can reach as many students as possible. Okay. So it's one of those key components. All right, so let's talk a little bit about universal design for learning. For us to get into this. So universal design for learning, it's a framework, right? It's an approach. I remember when we first started talking about UDL, it felt like a checklist, like gotta do this, gotta do this, gotta do this, gotta do this, right? But it's not. It's more of a framework in order for us to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all students by setting clear, rigorous goals, anticipating barriers, and proactively designing to minimize those barriers. I always talk about when I always say when I was a baby teacher, right? But when I was a baby teacher, I would often teach the math lesson, however it was prescribed in the text, and then be like, oh no, these 15 kids didn't get it. What do I need to do now to be able to bring them up to speed, right? Whereas with UDL, we're taking more of a proactive approach, right? We're looking at the lesson prior to delivering it. We're thinking about who our students are, and where they might get stuck, what those barriers are, and designing for that beforehand. So that maybe instead of 15, I might have 7 or 8, right? That might need some extra support. So we're really designing so that all students can have access and support throughout. Just make cursor. All right, so the foundational concepts of UDL, and I have to say that it's changed. If you didn't realize, the UDL guidelines actually shifted just this past summer. They went from 2.0 to 3.0. The first 2 foundational concepts are pretty much the same. The first one being that the barrier is in the design and not the learner. I can't tell you how many times I've been guilty of saying things like, my kids don't know their math facts, they can't do the test, right? Or they can't access the math task. But when we say things like that, we're putting the barrier on the kid, right? Or on the student. We're saying that they don't know their math facts. The switch of the language there might now be saying something like memorizing or memorization of multiplication facts is a barrier to students accessing it. So now instead of trying to fix the child or the student, right, we're trying to fix something in the environment or a tool and say, okay, if memorization is your barrier, here's a multiplication chart, or here's a strategy, or here's another visual that can help support you instead. Okay, the next one is that variability is the norm it's contextual and it can be planned for. And I think I'm speaking for everyone in the group that like when you come into a classroom, you pretty much know what to expect, right? We're going to have students that have language barriers. We're going to have some students who perform very, very high academically or they're below standard. We're going to have students who are very active learners, who are very kinesthetic. We're going to have the ones who prefer to keep to themselves, right? We know going in that there's going to be a lot of variability no matter what classroom we're going into. And a key shift of universal design for learning is the goal. Before, the goal was becoming an expert learner. And they've actually changed that recently to the goal of UDL being learner agency. So just kind of a thought there. Why do you think the shift from expert learner, and this isn't in our digital planner, but why the shift from expert learner to learner agency, you think? And you can answer in the chat too if you like. I don't think you can see me, but.
I feel like expert learner like implies some type of perfection. Like there's this like elite goal I'm supposed to get to as an expert.
Right. And so just to reiterate, if you couldn't hear him, expert learner sounds like there's a goal, right? That there's almost an end, right? There's almost an end point, right? That like once I become the expert, I must be done. Right? As opposed to learner agency, what does that mean?
They might not be an expert, but they have knowledge that is valuable.
Mhm.
They have an asset that can contribute still.
Right. Their knowledge is valuable. They still have an asset that can contribute. And then Debbie is mentioning in the chat too that an expert learner does have agency, right? And when we're talking about learner agency, that's when the students are able to have control over their learning. They know how they best learn. They can pick the tools that they need and the resources that they need in order to solve the problem, no matter what the problem is, right? But when we say expert learner, it does feel very finite, right? Like, oh, I know everything about volcanoes. I must be done, right? But in this case, it's no matter what I'm encountering and what I'm learning, I can make those adjustments. Okay, right. So these are the 9 facets of learner variability. And they're color-coded according to the UDL guidelines. Okay, so we have interest, effort and resilience, emotional well-being, the way that our learners perceive content is a variable, language, background knowledge, the way that they physically navigate their skills, the way that they communicate, and even executive function skills. So those are the 9 things that would be different and diverse amongst all of our learners. Okay, the UDL guidelines really encompass these 9 aspects of learner variability. And it just shows where they fall as far as which network they fall under, whether it's engagement, the why, representation, the what, and then action expression, how they show us their learning there. All right. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of time to kind of think about learner variability. And I want you to reflect upon your current planning process. So like when you're going in and either planning a lesson or maybe when you're working with teachers and they're planning a lesson, how do we currently identify the scope of learner variability in our classroom or in the classrooms of the ones we're supporting? Which learner variable components are easiest to plan for? Which ones are the hardest to plan for? And I can pull those back up. So which ones here are easier to plan for, harder to plan for? How do we take into account that learner variability? And thanks for putting that in the chat, Kristen. Let's go ahead and do breakout rooms for maybe, let's say like 4 minutes. What did we put there? About 4 or 5 minutes.
That's a quick question.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
What do you mean by perceived content? Is that like how the learner perceives the content?
How the learner perceives the content, right? Like I would rather read an article on how to do something, but my husband's like, where's the YouTube video? Right, so there's that piece. Okay. So Kristen, whenever you're ready, you can put that in the chat and then we can chat here. Thank you.
You said 4 minutes?
Yes. Other questions? Identify the scope. When you're supporting teachers, you're both in admin.
Yeah. I,
My background is coaching, yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, when you are going in and supporting a teacher, and they want help with, like, making sure that whatever it is that their units are accessible, that this sort of variability, I mean, is that often a topic of conversation, either?
it's honestly something I'm thinking of. But, you know, like all the, interestingly, like the work I'll do if we end up coaching and co-planning lessons.
Yeah.
Will always involve those conversations when applying it to the students in the classroom.
Right.
But when I plan my own PD, I don't hardly ever think about it, ironically. But looking at the list, and I'm looking at like how they might perceive the content, but also background knowledge. I do a lot of my work is with elementary teachers. And there is, I think, a belief, or at least a stated belief within our systems that they're traditionally not math people, you know?
Yeah.
Which has not actually been as much the case as it seems, as it is so prevalent to say that, you know? And so sometimes planning for their background knowledge can be a challenge. Yeah.
I think sometimes like with students, every now and then you can kind of predict the background knowledge, but then again, there's so many like bunches of knowledge that they come in with, right? Like culture, family life, what their own traditions and that kind of feel that whatever context we're using even in that it's like I'm doing one on culturally sustained pedagogy tomorrow. And as I was doing my research on it, they keep talking about how textbooks always assume like when they do a real world problem, that the context that they're using is culturally neutral. That like everyone will experience. Like this idea of marbles just
Right.
that.
Like, how did you write something that's culturally neutral?
Right. And so like they just have this assumption that like whatever they're gonna put out there, and if everyone and their mom is going to be able to connect to, right? That's not always, it's not going to be the case. And so all we've grown up with these culturally neutral problems, when in fact, there's a lot of bias, right? With all of them. But that makes it tough on the education. But you know, it's just one of those things to consider as well. I feel like I would often plan for interest, right? Like you're always trying to watch it and make things exciting. Even the way that they perceive content, like knowing whether it's reading levels for things or ones that want, you know, are more interested in like videos versus the reading aspect. Communication skills. One thing that I rarely ever plan for, and I always have discussion, is the executive function stuff, that strategy development. I've had teachers say stuff like, I modeled it. We did it together, but when they did it on their own, they didn't know what to do. They were like deer in headlights. And I was like, no, we literally have to teach them how to think about what and explain yourself. Right. And that's a hard thing to find. It's a tough one. It used to say like self-regulation right there, but now it's emotional well-being, like building emotional capacity. So what it actually is, what it is now. Okay. Which I found very, very interesting.
It used to be self-regulation.
Yeah, the ability to self-regulate.
Yeah.
But now it's how to build that emotional capacity so that they're emotionally well in order for them to be able to access support, you know. Yeah.
And that is interesting, because when I hear, not seeing it on the list, hear self-regulation, like mentally my mind goes towards, well, did they really want to say conform?
Right. Compliance, right?
Like, compliance, conform, and then like, I can imagine a group of educators putting around like, well, we can't write that conform.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it is interesting that.
Yes. And then so, yeah, that part's huge because it's like, I have two of my kiddos are on the spectrum and I always hear self-regulate, right? And it's like you're pushing my kid into this box that has to be calm in order for him to I guess, in their eyes, right, perform, right? But, you know, fidgeting with his Lego helps him focus, right? Being able to whine for like a good 10 to 15 seconds prior to engaging in something actually helps him get that emotionally out. And then, you know, then they can focus from there. But yeah, that piece was a huge shift.
Well, it's coming from a deficit mindset. When you get it done,
Yeah,
right?
deficit,
Whereas,
definitely.
Like me, the word family.
Mhm.
So they can have understanding. So
Yes.
what do you need? Positive space. You need a fidget right away.
Right, uh-huh.
You need a fidget in order to get to that.
Right. So for those of us who are joining us virtually, we're having a discussion about that learner variability point of emotional well-being and how that used to really be about self-regulation and the power of it being emotional well-being at this point too. Anyone in the virtual world want to respond to any of those questions that we posed? Yeah. Okay.
We were
All
just
right. So
sharing, sorry, we were just sharing how providing opportunities for students to talk, whether it's like a welcoming opener or a brain break, you know, give them something to talk about. You can learn a lot about their interests and where they're at emotionally. And also just getting them opportunities to talk about mathematics will give you insight in terms of their background knowledge or you know, language knowledge around the content.
no, definitely, that's a great strategy. Heidi. So we're gonna go ahead and move on. Heidi, did you want to talk about the UDL refresher here?
Yeah. So when we were looking at these 3 areas for the foundational core concepts, we're then thinking about the UDL design process that comes from that. And that's going to be setting clear and rigorous goals, anticipating that variability, as well as designing options to minimize barriers based on the specific variability within your classroom. And so when we're designing on the next slide, we're thinking about 5 different areas where we're anticipating variability and minimizing barriers. And that's within the goals themselves. It's within the materials, how the content is being represented, and the methods, how it's being delivered, the assessment, how learning is being demonstrated. And I love that word demonstrated here. It's not just being assessed, which is kind of action on the behalf of the teacher, but demonstrated is kind of focused on the action of the student. And then environment, how the climate and culture is supportive of the learning. And so those are the 4 different areas that we typically want to consider. And on the next slide, it shows some examples of where we might be, or the options within those 5 pieces. So like the goals, we're thinking knowledge, skills, that we have are and using some sentence frames for that. Materials, there's examples of materials we could be thinking about utilizing, and the various methods, assessments, and environments. So we wanted folks to reflect on their current planning process and think about, for mathematics in particular, which area is most difficult to consider when anticipating barriers to learning. So when I'm thinking about the barriers and anticipating them, which areas is most difficult to anticipate the barriers in? And do we have a breakout now, Arienne? I can't remember. I apologize.
I believe we do have a breakout for them. Actually, we do not. It's a please type in chat.
It's
That's
a
what it
please
is.
type in chat. Thank you
It's a
so
please
much.
type in chat. Yes.
All right. So in the
Okay.
chat, if you wouldn't mind adding, what area is most difficult and why? And I can start us off while you guys are thinking. I will admit that sometimes the methods is an area that I have the most trouble because I am prone to go with specific types of pedagogy based off of my own preference. And I don't always anticipate the struggles others are going to have.
Yeah, I think for me, I want to solve all the problems in the world. So goals is the one that's difficult because I find myself trying to fit, I think it's the mommy in me, like 5 goals in one, thinking I'm doing more by adding more goals to it, when in fact, it's probably better if there's just one succinct one.
I think I tend to do things tend to lean towards like mode of learning.
I was saying I tend to lean towards a constructivist mode of learning. And sometimes I'm not great with the methods part because I don't make the connections as clear, perhaps, for students as they could be.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to, Dennis. And in the chat, we have several. And Debbie says materials depends on the curricular resources available. Yeah, that can be definitely hard. Technology has its limits, right? Or even physical if you don't, budgets have their limits. And Ashley says, I think for the teachers I work with, the assessments are the most difficult to plan for when anticipating barriers. I agree. We have very traditional assessments that we think of. This is the assessment, and sometimes it's hard to get out of that mindset. And Debbie adds, methods often need to find or create ways for students to discover, make connections.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and move on to the idea that math is a different ballgame. So Dennis was actually mentioning this, I think, during the first breakout when we were all chatting here in the room about how, what was he saying? Oh, about how a lot of people say that they're not math people, right? They're like, oh, no, but it's math, right? And we can show snippet after snippet in media of people just being like, oh, I'm not good at math. Oh, and it's just accepted, right? That's just okay. And so we have a little graphic here about how to be a math person, right? Step 1, do math, any type. And step 2, just be a person, right? Every single person is a math person. If you wake up to an alarm clock, you are a math person, right? If you put something into a microwave, you are a math person. We're always dealing with math, and math is everywhere. And so there's no way that people are not math people because every single person deals with math. A lot of times too, when it comes to mathematics, a lot of people think that there's only one way to solve anything, right? When it comes to math, right? What's the way your teacher taught you? That's the way, and that's done, right? And so math is just different. I feel like with language arts, with humanities, there's this openness and like, sure, discover, what do you think? Justify that, right? There's this poetry about it, right? Which we're trying to revive in the world of mathematics with the new framework. But historically, mathematics has not been this creative subject area. Okay, so we're gonna do a little math activity. Taking a look at what you see on the screen, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And what can you create? And those of you in the virtual world, you can go ahead and feel free to add what you're thinking in the chat as well. Jamie or Dennis?
I can talk really well. I don't need a mic. I have a teacher voice. I noticed that all of the shapes in front of me.
I noticed it looked a lot like a floor plan to an apartment I used to live in.
I wonder if it is floor plan.
But I also noticed
Then as you put it up on a bigger screen, a spiral, like a 1-1-2, like the
Fibonacci sequence.
starting at the small square 1-1, and then it's 2x2, and then
Huh?
5x5.
Oh, but then it went to 8.
No, that would work. Yeah.
3, 5, 8, yeah.
Heidi, is that why you picked it? I don't think so, but I don't remember if that was why you picked it, but I don't think I noticed that before. Kristen in the chat, anything?
Yes.
Mhm.
Debbie stated, I noticed a rectangle with different sized squares, 8x8, 5x5, 3x3, 2x2, 1x1.
Mhm.
And there's a wondering from Debbie as well, which is, I wonder why those sized squares were used.
Yeah.
And it was mentioned that there's a lot of double sound with the microphone,
Okay.
but they can hear us as long as we're talking and projecting loud.
Okay,
Okay.
then I can I'm gonna this is
Yeah.
gonna live here. Okay, that works. Okay. All right, and I guess the last question that we wanted to ask too is, and we mentioned it, you mentioned the Fibonacci sequence that you noticed. Debbie is actually already alluding to it. She's seeing like the 8x8, the 5x5. Any other maths that we're noticing this activity?
Well, I purposely used the word square, but
Mhm.
in order to do that, I had to check, make sure there were sides.
Oh, there we
So a
go.
little geometry.
A little geometry, yeah. Little proof there. Okay, right. And move on. Okay, so Heidi, did you want to take the lead on being able to describe the belief sort?
Yeah, so we have a sort in digital land through the use of Google Slides as well as in person with paper. And we're gonna kind of think through that type of activity, although it was very, very, very short. Trying to think of the statements that might be aligned with the math activity that we just reviewed. Some of the card statements are seen on the screen here. For example, one of them is the role of the teacher is to engage students in tasks that promote reasoning and problem solving, facilitate discourse that moves students towards shared understanding of mathematics. So would that be aligned or not aligned with the activity we just engaged in? Briefly. And I believe the next slide shows an image of the link to activity.
That's not.
Yeah.
Older teachers to tell students. Do you want me to move them to breakout rooms? Who does?
Oh yeah, we could do that. Maybe just 4 minutes or so.
Uh-oh.
So we're gonna move you digital or virtual folks into a very quick breakout room. Is that okay, Heidi?
Yeah, let's just do one because I just realized the link, I believe, goes to just one copy.
Oh, okay.
I will just push everyone.
Just push everyone in there.
Yes, please.
Open. I'll let them know how many minutes did you want?
4 minutes.
Okay.
Counting down.
What's the form two?
It's kind of aligns with open-ended tasks and closed. Like this literally that which it is what they have for they have like a table method that can house. And then we just created repeating on this. I think that's universal. Learning acceleration. There's anyone that has this like this, and they can share it for universal. So it's also right. We have the open-ended tasks that we them sure forever. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. As a teacher, don't even have to do as much daily as far as that is concerned. So all of this. Yeah, and demonstrate some kind of learning or some kind of understanding or knowledge, but. Yeah. See. Okay.
Arienne?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So we went through that and we looked at how the beliefs were like, because Debbie rightly guessed that this is from the belief sort, the NCTM principles to action.
Definitely noticed that too.
Mhm. And then I would say the secondary question would be to add on to essentially add on to this activity by thinking about, okay, some of these beliefs could be like, does this activity fully embody that belief? And if not, how could we modify the activity to more fully embody that belief? And thinking about modifications to the activity by that.
Right.
Did you guys have anything come out of your in person while you were doing it?
It was just really the connection of to the NCTM, right, belief sort, and also to the framework about using open and engaging tasks, and how you know, that's literally the, I guess, the opening for all students to be able to have access. A very clear connection.
Learning acceleration
And universalism for learning. So.
Yeah. So in this one, we were asked to think about if the piles represented two different classrooms, what these students would think math is, because we're trying to attend to that definition of math. And how through newer resources, the framework, so forth, we're actually kind of thinking about what math is a little differently. I believe we added the question in the chat because our intent was to have people talk about it, but we could just have an open general dialogue as well.
So if we think, or if for students
or the beliefs that are aligned with the activity, what do we think those students believe about math?
Jamie or
Well, I would think that if any student group, they think they can do math, that they have an entry point, they have an ability to contribute.
Successful. Whereas the kids in group C might think that they don't have anything to contribute or they're not good at math.
yeah, it's true.
Debbie mentioned math is open versus math is closed.
Yes. Heidi, can you hear the double or is it gone now?
It's
Okay.
gone.
Okay. Yeah, there it picked up a little bit again when Jamie was talking, but
Okay, so I believe next is a video.
okay, so we'll see how the sound works on this. Did you want to give any intro to the video before I show it, Heidi, or are you okay?
I think we're okay. And we're starting
Come on.
People who didn't believe that they could learn anything. So this shows us something that brain scientists have known for a long time, that our cognition and what we learn is linked to our beliefs and to our feelings. And this is important for all of us, not just kids in math classrooms. If you go into a difficult situation or a challenging situation and you think to yourself, I can do this, I'm going to do it, and you mess up or fail, your brain will grow and more and react differently than if you go into that situation thinking, I don't think I can do this. So it's really important that we change the messages kids get in classrooms. We know that anybody can grow their brain, and brains are so plastic, to learn any level of maths. We have to get this out to kids. They have to know that mistakes are really good. But maths classrooms have to change in a lot of ways. It's not just about changing messages for kids. We have to fundamentally change what happens in classrooms. And we want kids to have a growth mindset, to believe that they can grow and learn anything. But it's very difficult to have a growth mindset in maths if you're constantly given short, closed questions that you get right or wrong. Those questions themselves transmit fixed messages about math, that you can do it or you can't. So we have to open up maths questions so that there's space inside them for learning. And I want to give you an example now. We're actually going to ask you to think about some maths with me. So this is a fairly typical problem that's given out in schools, and I want you to think about it a bit differently. So we have 3 cases of squares, and in case 2 there's more squares than in case 1, and in case 3 there's even more. And often this is given out with the question, how many squares would there be in case 100 or case n? But I want you to think of a different question now. I want you to think without any numbers at all, or without any algebra. I want you to think entirely visually. And I want you to think about, where do you see the extra squares? If there are more squares in case 2 than case 1, where are they? So if we were in a classroom, I'd give you a long time to think about this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to show you some different ways people think about this. And I've given this problem to many different people. And I think it was my undergrads at Stanford who said to me, or one of them said to me, I see it like raindrops, where raindrops come down on the top. So it's like an outer layer that grows new each time. It was also my undergrads who said, oh no, I see it more like a bowling alley. You get an extra row, like a row of Skittles that comes in at the bottom. Very different way of seeing the growth. It was a teacher, I remember, who said to me, it was like a volcano. The center goes up and then the lava comes out. There was another teacher who said, oh no, it's like the parting of the Red Sea. The shape separates and there's a duplication with an extra center. And I remember this this one as well. Some people see it as triangles. They see the outside growing as an outside triangle. And then it was a teacher in New Mexico who said to me, oh, it's like Wayne's World. Stairway to heaven, access denied. And then we have this way of seeing it. If you move the squares, which you always can, and you rearrange the shape a bit, you'll see that it actually grows as squares. So this is what I want to illustrate with this question. When it's given out in maths classrooms, and this isn't the worst of questions, it's given out with a question of how many. And kids count. So they'll say in the first case there's 4, in the second there's 9. They might stare at that column of numbers for a long time and say, if you add 1 to the case number each time and square it, then you get the total number of squares. But when we give it to students and teachers, high school teachers, and I'll say to them when they've done this, so why is that squared, do you think? Why do you see that squared function? They'll say, no idea. So this is why it's squared. The function grows as a square, and you see that squaring in the algebraic representation. So when we give these problems to students, we give them the visual question. We ask them how they see it. They have these rich discussions, and they also reach deeper understandings about a really important part of mathematics. So we actually need a revolution in maths classrooms. We need to change a lot.
Awesome. So I believe we have a pause and reflect after this, because we're thinking about the beliefs you're hoping to impart to your students, as well as thinking about how did your own teachers influence your beliefs about mathematics?
Okay, thank you. Did she say she does want them to go to breakout room?
No, these are just in the chat.
Just in the chat.
Mhm.
It's an opportunity for reflection, something that we as humans typically don't do very much with. So we're trying to allow for it.
Do you want us to share out, or are we supposed to be paying?
You can share out.
So I remember when I was in elementary school, my teachers had curriculum with workbooks that were different colors. So like you were either in the green book, the yellow book, workbook, red workbook. And so we all weren't supposed to know what color meant your level, but they were all associated with the level. But I always remember being in like the middle to lower level, and like just how like shameful and humiliating it felt, because I never would be at the higher level workbooks that the smarter kids were working on. So yeah, it was all working out of a workbook and level base, and shameful. I grew up thinking I was terrible at math. I didn't think I was good at math until I became a teacher and I had to teach math.
And it honestly hasn't changed very much for some curriculums.
Yes.
Some curriculums are still very workbook based and very much teacher the front, and they're copying down, following the teacher, right? So I'm not sure about the level piece, but it's still that type of focus. Math is doing workbooks.
It's funny because I totally agree with both of you. That was my experience, right? And I remember the last textbook I used when I was a classroom teacher, there was always the differentiation was in the level A, B, C worksheet or test that was provided by the publisher. But it's also like there's so many, we could spend all day talking about this because there's so many structures that, like Joe Bowler said, in that when you continually get single problems with right or wrong answers, like it doesn't matter how much I talk to you about growth mindset, and if I, as a teacher, if I talk to you about growth mindset all day, and then I give you a grade on a quiz that's final,
Right.
that it doesn't matter. The what we do is gonna far outweigh what we say,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
'Cause that was my experience. I remember, and I don't know why I ended up staying with math. I think it was because I was good at school math, like following steps and procedures. But like I have the exact, memory of my third grade teacher with flashcards and
Yep.
racing, with 2 lines down the middle of the class. And if you got it right, you went to the back. And if you got it wrong, you just stayed there getting them wrong for 10 minutes, like that, and that
Oh,
exact, I have that exact memory of third grade and whatnot. So it still, I'm surprised sometimes that I'm all, okay, yeah,
That's
but I stuck with math for some reason. Well, I guess I really didn't. I got a degree in history. So, and then a minor in math.
forgot. You forgot.
And a credit in math. So, but here
Thank you.
I think for me, the beliefs that I want to make sure that I impart to students, and I guess even now parents in the role that I'm in at this point, is that, math is creative and it's open-ended, and we're not here to teach kids to be robots and follow like steps and procedures. We want them to be able to solve it in ways that work best for them. My cousin came to me and she's like, why are there so many different ways of solving problems now? And I was like, so you solved all your problems in one way? And I think it doesn't hit them that math and that we're trying to gear math in the classroom for when they're just in their day to day, right? Like how to solve their day to day, right? It's very textbook oriented. And so I think as far as imparting beliefs to students and parents, right, that we're building problem solvers and we're trying to build learner agency, right? Pick what works best for them.
Focusing on the SMPs.
Yes.
But it's also like what Dennis brought up, a lot of our routines and just our structure, our system of teaching doesn't help our efforts to have math be more creative and visual and fun and open-ended and not so prescriptive. And yeah, it's difficult. It's a difficult thing. It's not as easy as just do some open-ended tasks.
No, right? Because you have to be very intentional with these open-ended tasks as well.
Yeah, as soon as everybody, the teachers we work with, and I'm not blaming teachers
No.
because it's a legitimate question they often ask is, these are all great, but how do I grade that?
Right.
Because our
Yes.
system is built on that grading system.
Yes.
So I mean, they're legitimate, like tug of war between what we're trying to do within the structure of our system.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that brings us to UDL goals. And I think a lot of this, the mindset, or I guess traditional mindset around mathematics, is because of the types of math goals that are written within our curriculums and even within our standards. And so just to kind of backtrack a little bit, when it comes to UDL design, the very, very first step of the design process is setting clear and rigorous goals. And so universally designed goals, they're meant to be clear and discrete, flexible without the means embedded, relevant and meaningful, challenging and rigorous. And our big focus for today is really on that second bullet point, because in math, a lot of times, and even in our standards, the means is embedded. They tell you use an area model in order to solve blank, right? Use the standard algorithm in order to blah, 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 right? They tell us exactly how to get there, which can be a huge struggle as far as how do we allow for flexibility. Okay, so we're really going to focus on this question, that second one there, about are the means or the how separated from the goal, and how can we do that with math? Okay, so one way that we can do this is to remove the barriers from the learning experience, is to start with a goal-free form, or goal free from the means used to achieve the goal. So when we're talking about the term means, we're referring to the manner or way in which the goal is attained. So like I just mentioned, area model, using a standard algorithm, you must use a place value chart in order to blank, right? Okay. So let's ask ourselves, and I can't remember if we put this in the chat or not, but how have we offered flexibility in how our learners can work toward the goal in math? How have we empowered learners to choose the means they will use to achieve the goal? Yeah, we can kind of put that in the chat, have an open discussion. How did you allow for flexibility for your learners? Because like you said, you started liking math when you had to teach math as a teacher, right? Be done.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm gonna hit this, like, I think this is what you mean.
Mhm.
I was going back and thinking of, the variability that I often haven't thought of.
Mm.
So,
Mhm.
and recently I've been working with a group of teachers that we wanted to get them, to be more intentional about the incorporation of the SMPs.
Yes.
into their plan. And I'm thinking about the way I went about doing it was exploring a few different ways the SMPs are grouped together, whether it's like Grace and Amy's little umbrella from routines for reasoning,
Oh, right.
or
Mhm.
Pam Seda has a nice visual of like what SMPs do you use daily and which ones are dependent upon content. And we explored those, but I was thinking like I could have been more flexible and said like, I'd like you to focus on SMP3 and find resources, explore these resources or find other resources that give you a better idea of what that SMP looks like at your particular grade.
Mhm.
It's gonna look different for a second grade teacher than a 10th grade teacher.
Right.
Kind of thing. And I couldn't, like, I'm thinking about it now, UDLizing it more so that they have more options in the pathways they have to get to the content, because actually it makes the content more meaningful for them.
Mhm.
Because they can laser focus on their particular grade level,
Right.
essentially.
Mhm. They kind of, they create the path
Mhm.
for how they understand or how they integrate the SMPs more intentionally.
Right.
Things.
One in the chat
Mm-hmm.
from Debbie, and it is flexibility is how they make sense of the problem and want to approach it.
Yes.
And Heidi mentioned this can be super difficult because it also requires so much prep time to build in flexibility.
Yes. Right. Especially when we're working with like either a curriculum or something that tells you exactly how they have to get there. We have to figure out, okay, we kind of almost have to unzip it, right? So that it can be more open for our students and, use the whiteout and get rid of the whole using the strategy, right? And allow them to pick whatever strategy works best for them.
You mentioned earlier that another barrier to doing this is the way the standards are written.
Yes.
So a lot of the standards, like, it talks about using partial products.
Yes.
Like, it says that in standards. So
Mhm.
if you're given a textbook that uses the standards, right,
Mhm.
and the objective of the lesson has the standard embedded in it, you've already told your learners that they have to use partial products they have to learn how to use that.
Uh-huh.
So I think, thinking back to my coaching days, when I would coach a teacher and talk about, once you've taught those strategies, now what open-ended task can you give them so that they can implement and apply some of those strategies that they use?
Right.
But on a daily level, this is very challenging
It
for
is.
teachers.
Mhm.
On a daily level.
Right. Having that openness. All right. So when it comes to being able to have that flexibility, we need to make sure that we're looking at the goals and we're looking at the standards and thinking about, are the means separated from the goal? So let's look at this 4th grade standard here, right? Multiply, like it literally says, multiply 3 and 4 digit numbers by 1 digit numbers, applying the standard algorithm. So in this case, what's the means? The standard algorithm, right? And so when
Meaning less separated? Like, I'm the point about the standards earlier, like they sometimes get in the way.
or they often clump it all together that make it seem very, very rigid, that when I'm teaching 4th grade, I better be only using 3 and 4 digit numbers by 1 digit numbers, and I'm only teaching them the standard algorithm because that's what they're going to be assessed on to see that they have fourth grade, quote unquote, mastery, right? And so if we were to open that up a little bit, we might say something like, demonstrate your understanding of multiplication between 3 and 4 digit by 1 digit numbers using place value understanding and the properties of operations. So instead of telling them use the standard algorithm, we want to know where they're at with multiplication and their understanding of multiplication. When we teach the standard exactly the way it is, and we see what students give us, it often gives us that deficit lens of that one can't do it, they can't do it, they can't do it, they can't do it. But if we allow for it to be a little bit more open-ended, then we can kind of see, I guess, along a continuum, what are the things that they do know how to do? And what do I need to do next in order for them to be able to hit this piece here, right? So it's that assets-based lens. It's understanding where they're at, where they're at in the progression of multiplication and where we can go next. The piece.
We're sort of breaking down the standard algorithm, right? So to
Right.
do they even understand what the standard algorithm is?
Mhm.
Because it requires an understanding of place value and those properties of operations, right? So we're not just saying apply it. Apply it is super broad. And so we're trying to break that down to what are the pieces
Mhm.
underneath the knowledge,
Yeah.
not just the skill.
Right. Just the actual prerequisites, right? That lead to that. Okay. So here are some examples of goals. And I guess the question for this one is, where are the means embedded? So like I can use the greater than, equal than, and less than symbols to record comparisons of multi-digit numbers in my math journal, right? So for that one, what do they have to use? They have to use the inequality symbols, right? Can they show it in other ways? Sure, right? But with this goal, we're kind of pigeonholing them into you must do it in this way, right? What about for some of the other ones there? Where else do you see the means embedded? The symbols orally present. Thank you, Debbie. Debbie said like orally present. Do they have to orally present to show their understanding? Not necessarily, right? That's that action expression. Mm-hmm. Right. But could they do it algebraically? Could they be, think of all the different ways that they can still show or like solve, right? Some linear equations. And then that bottom one I kind of alluded to earlier, right? Using area model and multiplication. Fourth bullet can be a little bit tricky, but I think our first option for what to do when the means are embedded might be able to help. Yeah. It could be. A lot of times, and then maybe it's not necessarily the means itself, but sometimes we're restricted with the complexity of the numbers that we choose as well. Because you were mentioning, right, like they have to know the strategy of partial products, let's say, right? But if my goal as a teacher is I need for them to understand how partial products work, does it matter if I'm using a 2 by 1, a 3 by 1, challenging some to do a 4 by 2? Because what I'm looking for is can they use partial products? Right, can they use the strategy? But they can access it maybe with different complexities. Okay, so pause and reflect when it comes to this one here. Why could it seem difficult to separate the means from the goal in mathematics? And Kristen just put in the chat too. How do our beliefs about math affect our ability to separate the means from the goal?
So I think you answered both of those a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
one of the struggles sometimes shifting those mindsets is it seems like over the last decade, a lot of our curriculum that's been provided has interpreted our standards as like a series of models to show kids how to solve a problem.
Yes.
Like we did this model, now we're gonna do this model, and we're gonna do this model for addition. And so because it's presented that way, it can seem like the goal is the model,
Right.
you know, instead of, and so you end up like reinforcing that belief that I need to say, use an area model to solve this, right? Instead of, there may be a time where that's the direction, if I want to know, if I do truly want to know who can and who can't use an area model. You know, but if I'm looking at like who can multiply, then that's not, there's no need for those means.
Right. Yeah, it's very prescribed in that way.
Deb dropped a comment in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
You stated the goal might be to solve a system of equations, and there are multiple ways to do that. Graph, substitution, elimination. So at some point, I will want to focus on teaching one method, so students have multiple tools down the road depending on the form of the equations in the system. At some point, I may want to include the means in the goal.
Right.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think, but it's like when we're first introducing something, right? And once we've kind of layered the knowledge, we could see that coming into play. That, you know, in the beginning can be tough.
Hey, that made me think of helping my son with his 7th grade homework. They had a series of word problems to do where the goal was really to be able to write an equation that helped solve the problem. But because it's 7th grade and they're being introduced to equations and, you know, 2-step and multi-step equations, most of the problems were actually easy enough for him to just reason through without writing an equation.
Right.
You know, and so it was hard for him to find the motivation to reach the goal, because in his mind, the goal was to get an answer.
Right.
You know, and so it was a tricky thing, because it's almost like in that situation, I can see an example of why you would want the means of write an equation to solve this problem, because you're really assessing whether they can write the equation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, the goal is to solve or to represent algebraic.
But it's important to recognize what you're giving up at that point.
Yes. Yeah. Heidi, do you wanna?
Yes. So I think Debbie perfectly situated us to start talking about when the means is the goal. So we're going to give a few examples of that. So let's look over these 4. Measure angles in whole number degrees using a protractor. Sketch angles of specified measure. And then there's a few more here, and I've just been given the 10-minute warning, so I'm not going to read them.
Everything that's bolded and italicized.
Yeah, using the standard algorithm, tables, graphs, equations. So very similar, right? And these are specific standards. So we're going to give you 3 different options, and this is the meat of it, right? So option 1, provide tiered number sets. Option 2, allow for multiple representations, concrete, visual, and abstracted. Option 3, focus on conceptual understanding. And so we're going to show you what we mean by that. So option 1, tiered number sets. So we're giving various variations of the problem associated with that goal. And then we're also giving a variety of numbers that they could use within that problem. So for example, and Arienne, you jump in if I'm not saying this correctly. We're instead of multiply 3-digit by 1-digit, we're going to just say multiple digit whole numbers. Using the standard algorithm, and that worksheet could look like the following.
Sorry, my clicker's not being.
So instead of solve all the problems, we're saying solve one of the following problem sets. Yes, mild, medium, spicy, totally, Debbie. So in building thinking classrooms, I believe she's referring to. So like A, B, C, D, or E, F, and students are given choice. And this allows that flexibility and differentiation, as well as some student agency on choosing which one they feel most comfortable with. Anything to add, Arienne?
Nope, got it. And you can tell that the complexity of the numbers, right? So the goal is standard algorithm. They have to use a standard algorithm, but they can choose, you know, something that's just right. I think about my elementary is pick a book that's just right. Goldilocks and the 3 Bears kind of a thing. right? Which one is just right for you?
Perfect. So here's another example. So original task to solve the following word problem. And then the redesign task is allow students to choose the number set that's just right for them in order to solve it. So same problem essentially. It's just that the numbers are removed and they get to choose the pair of numbers that they want to utilize. The other more option is yes, definitely add that explanation of the strategy or of the one they chose and of the strategy that they used to figure out their answer. We are not going to stop here. We are going to go on to number 2. Arienne, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, the second option is to allow for multiple representations, and I think that for those of us who've been teaching for a long time, we allow for this. So making sure that we're allowing for concrete learning, maybe, and then
Arienne, we can't hear you.
Oh, did I mute?
No, you're good now. You're good now. Keep going.
Hello. Okay. Allowing for multiple representations, whether it's concrete, using actual manipulatives, being able to be visual. So we're drawing pictures, we're using tables, diagrams, and then abstract, going for that equation. And so this right here, when you click it, it'll actually bring you to the handout for it as a resource. But here's an example here. So identify the constant of proportionality unit rate in tables, graphs, equations, diagrams, and verbal descriptions of proportional relationships. So we might adjust that by saying, instead of identify the constant, and we might say make sense of it by comparing various representations, including these. So the first one tells you you have to use all of these, but the other one says you can choose from them. Which one do you want to use in order to be able to show the constant of proportionality?
We're also doing a comparison. So we're connecting the representations together to see where we can, where one, it might be represented differently.
Right, where they connect.
Thank you.
And then here's actually one from, I don't want to say, from a curriculum here. Sorry. Here's one from a curriculum. So if the original task said, find the constant of proportionality in a table, write the equation, we might redesign it by saying, compare the table of values and the equation representing the situation. How does the constant proportionality show up in both? How are they connected? So very similar to the standard that, or the goal that we rewrote from the standard earlier as well. So a lot of choice. It's a lot deeper as far as asking them to make connections. And then they get to decide which way to represent it that fits with their understanding the best.
And we can have them talk about it. We could have them write about it. We can have them, there's a variety of ways they could then demonstrate that understanding. And then the third one, focus on conceptual understanding, where we're multiplying these two fractions and we're thinking of, let's just keep going.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to give a different example. Measure angles in whole number degrees using a protractor. Sketch angles of specified measure. Again, we're saying connect the definition of an angle to the process of measuring angles in a whole number of degrees using a protractor. Identify and create angles of specified measure. So we're having them connect it rather than simply just do it with a protractor. But we're having them think about that process of a definition to the process of measuring.
And even removing that idea of sketch. So sometimes that can be a barrier for, like, I remember I could not figure out which dot to use on the protractor to save my life sometimes. And so the sketching became really tricky, but if I had a different tool or just another way of showing it, then it would have still been successful.
So here we're asked to physically measure it, and then maybe we're creating an explanation and describing how the definition of angle is related to the process of measuring an angle using a protractor.
All right. Okay. Do we want to have them reflect on all three? We're good.
We have 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Yes, we do. Okay. All right. So those are the 3 options. We were going to give us time for us to be able to try it on our own, but hopefully from those 3 options there, that gave us some ideas on how to open up some of the goals in mathematics so that it's accessible for most, if not all of our learners. Okay. All right. Okay. So a little bit of a pause and reflect, and just something for you to think about and to hold in your mind. How would allowing for multiple means change the responses you might get from students? And how can we apply this to our future goals and our own lessons? And just to kind of reiterate, I think it would give us more of an assets-based lens on what they can do versus what they cannot do. So for our intentional close, I just want you to think about anything that you've taken away, a couple questions, and maybe even something you'll implement next week. I honestly am not sure what the feedback form looks like, but if there's space for that in there, please feel free to put that in, because they will be sharing that with Heidi and myself too. Anything you've taken away, any questions you have. And then that is our session name right there. So we did it, Heidi. I think we had a lot of good mindset talk. A lot of good mindset talk. But yes.
I can empathize.
Mhm.
She has, you know,
Like,
so even when we go on the airplane, she goes on 2 reports. And then every training we go to, it's the first thing we say.
mhm.
We've not had a scare like that. So we had a scare today.
Yeah. She just said, Heidi, can you hear me? No? Yes? You can hear me? So Jamie said that she has a coworker with a very similar allergy to yours. So even when they travel, like she pre-boards, she wipes everything down, does the whole thing. So right, every training, don't bring in peanuts, the whole thing. So she empathizes with our situation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Dennis, Jamie, for joining us in person. And thank you for our virtual audience for joining us as well. It was great to see you again, Debbie. 2 sessions in a row. Yes. Oh, here's the feedback link in the chat.
You guys are awesome.
Digital download is not allowing me.
It's good to see you, Gabby.
Oh. I can, oh, I might be able to. Hold on. It's also in Sketch. Here you go. I think this is it. It's not the, yes. There you go.
Thank you.
No, it's okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.